Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind the clean comforts of our modern world and stepping into the dust, mud, and manure of the American Wild West. Forget the handsome cowboys with gleaming teeth, the noble sheriffs cleaning up town with a single perfectly aimed shot, and the saloons full of lively piano music. The reality was far grittier, smellier, and frankly, a lot more likely to give you a nasty infection than a heroic moment. We're going to explore why you, with all your 21st century sensibilities, probably wouldn't last a single day in the real. Unforgiving west of the 1870s, it was a time of brutal hardship, where survival was a daily, exhausting struggle against the elements, disease, and your own questionable life choices. So, I invite you to share in the comments where you are and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love to see our community of sleepy historians stretching across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just arrived in a burgeoning frontier town, perhaps in Kansas, or maybe a dusty settlement in the Arizona territory. The first thing that hits you is not the romance, not the adventure, but the smell. It's a thick, almost tangible bouquet, a rich symphony composed of unwashed bodies. Livestock, coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and the ever-present, all-encompassing aroma of manure. The streets, if you can call them that, are not paved with cobblestones. They are rivers of mud, churned into a brown, viscous soup by the hooves of horses and the wheels of freight wagons. You take a step off the stagecoach, and your boots sink 6 inches into a substance you sincerely hope is just mud. It is not. This is your grand entrance to the Promised Land, a place where the ground itself is a biohazard. The town is a chaotic jumble of hastily erected wooden buildings with false fronts designed to make them look taller and more important than they really are. A bit of architectural wishful thinking. Many are just tents, their canvas sides flapping in the relentless wind, offering little protection from the elements. There are no zoning laws here, no urban planning. A blacksmith shop, belching black smoke, sits right next to a laundry, which sits next to a livery stable, which is just a fancy name for a barn that perpetually smells of horse. The noise is a constant grating hum. The clang of the smith's hammer, the shouts of mule drivers, the distant, tinny plink of a piano from a saloon that sounds like it's being played with oven mitts, and the incessant buzzing of flies. So many flies. They are the unofficial welcoming committee of every town in the West, and they are thrilled to see you. You came here for opportunity, for a new start, for the dream of gold or land, or simply a life less ordinary. But as you stand there, ankle-deep in filth, surrounded by a cacophony of noise and a cloud of smells that could fell an ox, you have your first quiet realization.
Oh.
The dime novels may have exaggerated the glamour. The primary fact of life in these boomtowns was their sheer impermanence and chaos. They exploded into existence almost overnight, following a mineral strike or the path of a new railroad line. Buildings were thrown up with green, unseasoned lumber that would warp and crack within a year, leaving gaps in the walls for wind, dust, and enterprising rodents to slip through. There was no public sanitation system, no running water, and no organized trash collection. Waste was simply thrown into the street or a nearby ditch, creating a breeding ground for diseases that would sweep through the populace with terrifying efficiency. Now, here we find a fascinating point of scholarly debate. For decades, our image of the Wild West was one of utter lawlessness, chaotic free-for-all where gunfights erupted over a misplaced card and bandits rode through town with impunity. This view was largely shaped by sensationalized dime novels of the 19th century and later by Hollywood films. However, more recent historians, like Robert R. Dykstra, have challenged this myth. They argue that while these towns were certainly dangerous, they were not anarchic. In fact, many developed surprisingly rigid, albeit informal, social codes and systems of order very quickly. Business interests, for one, demanded a level of stability. You can run a successful general store or freight company if your customers are constantly being shot in the street. So, prominent citizens often formed vigilance committees, a sort of volunteer justice league with more hangings and less spandex. These groups enforced a rough and often brutal form of order long before any official lawmen arrived. So, the old idea of a town with no rules has given way to a more nuanced picture. a town with its own rules. Often enforced at the end of a rope, it's a bit of a grim joke, but your greatest danger might not have been a black-hatted outlaw, but a committee of well-meaning shopkeepers who decided your particular brand of snoring was a public nuisance. As you attempt to navigate the main thoroughfare, you learn the second rule of the West. Watch where you step. Always. You dodge a steaming pile of horse manure. Sidestep a puddle of what looks suspiciously like wee-cold beer, and leap over a dead rat with the athletic grace of a startled gazelle. A wooden sidewalk, a rare and celebrated luxury, is slick with mud and something you decide is probably just spilled gravy. You tell yourself it's gravy. It helps you sleep at night. You see a man stumble out of a saloon, take 2 steps, and disappear up to his knees in a particularly deep mud hole. No one helps him. They just watch, a few of them chuckling. This is the West's version of live entertainment. You finally make it to the door of the town's only hotel. 2-story fire trap optimistically named the Grand Palace Hotel and Emporium. The paint is peeling, a window is broken, and from within, you can hear a man arguing passionately with what sounds like a raccoon. This is it, your new home. You take a deep breath, steel yourself, and push open the door, stepping out of the mud and into your next challenge. You push open the door to the Grand Palace Hotel, and the smell of the street is immediately replaced by a new, more concentrated smell. This one is a heady mix of stale beer, unwashed wool, frying bacon, and a faint, sweet, cloying odor you later identify as desperation. The hotel lobby, which is also the saloon, which is also the dining room, is a hub of activity. Men with dusty hats and weary eyes lean against a long wooden bar, nursing glasses of whiskey. You approach the proprietor, a man whose apron has seen better decades, and secure a room for the night. He slides a key across the counter, and you notice the counter is sticky. Everything is sticky. You make a mental note to never touch anything with your bare hands ever again, a resolution you will break within the next 5 minutes. Your room is on the 2nd floor. It contains a bed, a chair, and a bucket. This, you realize with a sinking feeling, is the 5-star experience. The bed is a thin straw mattress laid over a rope frame, and you can already feel every lump, every mysterious pokey bit that will haunt your sleep. The true horror, however, awaits you in the morning. You feel the need to wash the trail dust from your face. In the hallway, you find the communal wash basin. It's a chipped ceramic bowl filled with murky, lukewarm water. Next to it hangs the pride of the establishment, the communal towel. This is a long loop of grayish cloth on a roller, and it has clearly been used by every guest, prospector, traveling salesman who has passed through these doors since the town was founded. You can see the history of the West in its stains. A little trail dust here, a bit of tobacco juice there, a mysterious gravy-like smear you decide not to investigate. Using it feels less like cleaning yourself and more like shaking hands with 100 strangers' germs. This single, sad, damp towel is a perfect metaphor for hygiene in the Wild West. A well-intentioned idea that has collapsed into a festival of bacteria. There were no paper towels, no hand sanitizer, just a shared piece of fabric and a prayer. A joke you'll hear later in the saloon is that the towel is the most sociable thing in town. It knows everyone's business. The fact is, people in the West were not bathing regularly. It was a luxury, a time-consuming and expensive one at that. A proper bath in a town's bathhouse, if one even existed, could cost up to $1 an entire day's wages for a common laborer. For that price, you got a tub of lukewarm water that had likely already been used by 3. Other people, a sliver of harsh lye soap that would strip the paint off a barn door, and the aforementioned communal towel. It was less of a spa day and more of a brief, expensive soak in a stranger's filth. Consequently, most people simply didn't bother. A splash of water on the face and hands was considered a thorough cleaning. Cowboys on the trail might go months without a proper bath, their smell becoming so potent it was said they could be identified by scent long before they were seen. This brings us to another fascinating, if slightly nauseating, scholarly debate. The popular myth, reinforced by gritty westerns, paints a picture of universal filth, where every single person was covered in a uniform layer of grime. The reality, as historians now argue, was more complex. While public spaces were indeed cesspools of disease and the standards of hygiene for transient men like cowboys and miners were shockingly low, there was a concerted effort by some to maintain cleanliness, particularly by the women who were tasked with creating homes in these chaotic environments. The so-called civilizing influence of women is a major theme in Western history. In domestic spaces, women waged a constant, exhausting war against dust, mud, and germs. They scrubbed wooden floors with lye, boiled laundry in giant copper kettles, aired out bedding in the rare moments the dust storms weren't blowing. Their diaries and letters are filled with laments about the sheer impossibility of keeping anything clean. So, the old image of a uniformly filthy West has been replaced by a more nuanced picture. A world of stark contrasts, where the public squalor of the saloon and the bunkhouse stood in direct opposition to the private, desperate struggle for cleanliness within the home. This lack of public sanitation had deadly consequences. With no sewer systems, human and animal waste contaminated the local water supply. Rivers and streams, the primary sources of drinking water, became potent cocktails of bacteria. Cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery were rampant killers. Sweeping through towns and mining camps with terrifying speed, an outbreak could wipe out a significant portion of a town's population in a matter of weeks. You learn quickly to be suspicious of the water. Does it taste a little earthy? That's probably the livestock upstream. Does it have a faint, metallic temps? That might be from the mining runoff, laced with arsenic and mercury. You take a sip from a well and hope for the best, knowing that a simple drink of water could be a death sentence. There were no water treatment plants, no Brita filters, just a bucket and a prayer. You start to understand why so many men drank whiskey for breakfast. At least the alcohol might kill a few of the germs. As you look at your own sad, lumpy bed in your closet-sized room, you realize that the dangers here aren't just the outlaws you read about. They're invisible, silent, and floating in the very air you breathe and the water you drink. Having abandoned all hope of personal hygiene, you make your way back downstairs to the saloon, your stomach rumbling with a mixture of hunger and dread. It's time for dinner. You find a seat at a wobbly wooden table, its surface carved with the initials of 100 forgotten travelers. The menu is simple because it's not written down. The proprietor just yells it at you. "We got stew and we got biscuits," he growls, as if daring you to ask for anything more complicated. You, wanting to live to see the morning, order the stew. This is a mistake, but in a world of mistakes, it feels like the least catastrophic one. What arrives is a bowl of brown, bubbling liquid with things floating in it. You identify a piece of potato, maybe a carrot, and several lumps of what is optimistically referred to as meat. This is the infamous mystery stew of the West, a perpetual concoction that sits on the back of the stove for days, if not weeks. New ingredients are tossed in as they become available. A bit of beef, some salted pork, a squirrel that looked at the cook the wrong way. The possibilities are as endless as they are horrifying. You take a hesitant bite. It tastes of salt, grease, and the ghost of 1,000 previous meals. The bread that comes with it, a sourdough biscuit, is hard enough to be used as a doorstop. But you gnaw on it gratefully, as it's the only thing in the bowl with a clearly identifiable origin. The diet of the average person in the West was a masterclass in monotony. Fresh vegetables and fruits were almost unheard of, unless you were lucky enough to live near one of the rare, well-tended gardens, usually run by a determined homesteader's wife. For cowboys on a cattle drive or miners in a remote camp, the menu was grimly consistent. Beans, bacon, and biscuits. Day after day. For months. The bacon was heavily salted to preserve it. The beans were boiled until they became a thick, flavorless mush. And the biscuits were cooked in a Dutch oven over an open fire. This lack of variety wasn't just boring, it was dangerous. Scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that causes your gums to bleed and your teeth to fall out, was a constant threat. Men would become weak, their joints would ache, and old wounds would reopen, all for the lack of a single orange. This is where another one of our most cherished Western myths comes into conflict with a much grimmer reality. We have this romantic image of the chuck wagon cook, a beloved, grizzled character serving up hearty, delicious meals to grateful cowboys around a crackling campfire. He was indeed a vital and often respected figure, but the food he served was purely functional, designed for caloric intake and little else. The old view paints a picture of cozy camaraderie and satisfying grub. But historical records and journals from cattle drives tell a different story. The food was repetitive and bland, a necessary evil to keep the men fueled for the back-breaking work. Fresh meat was only available on the rare occasion that a cow was injured and had to be put down. Otherwise, it was the same rotation of salted pork and beans. The coffee was famously bad, often called six-shooter coffee, because it was rumored to be strong enough to float a pistol. It was boiled with the grounds until it became a thick, bitter sludge, valued more for its caffeine kick than its taste. So, the scholarly debate here isn't about whether the food was important, but whether it was in any way enjoyable. The consensus among modern historians is that it was, for the most part, terrible. A far cry from the cinematic feasts we imagine. Back in the saloon, you wash down your mystery stew with a glass of whiskey. It's the safest thing to drink, though it burns a fiery path down your throat. The saloon itself is a microcosm of the town's dangers. The air is thick with smoke. The floor is covered in sawdust to soak up spilled beer and tobacco spit, and the clientele is a volatile mix of tired laborers, hopeful prospectors, and a few men with cold eyes who watch the room a little too closely. A card game is underway in the corner, the quiet punctuated by the slap of cards and the occasional muttered curse. You've seen enough movies to know that these games rarely end with a friendly handshake. You finish your meal, trying not to make eye contact with anyone, and retreat to the relative safety of your room. You lie on the lumpy mattress, the questionable stew, sitting like a lead weight in your stomach. The sounds of the saloon drift up through the floorboards, a sudden shout, a burst of laughter, the crash of a glass. You think about food back in your own time? The sheer variety, the freshness, the simple guarantee that what you're re-eating one tea give you a disease named after a river. Here, every meal is a gamble. Was the meat fresh? Was the water used to boil the potatoes clean? Was the cook having a good day, or a let's dash see dash if dash this dash is dash edible day? You close your eyes, your stomach gurgling in protest. You've survived your first dinner in the Wild West, the prize. A night of vivid, unsettling dreams, and the growing certainty that you might not have the stomach for this new life. You wake with a start, not to the gentle tones of a smartphone alarm, but to the sound of shouting in the street, followed by a single, flat, unromantic gunshot. Your first thought isn't to investigate. It's to roll off the lumpy mattress and onto the dusty floor. In this world, windows are not for scenic views. They are for stray bullets to pass through. After a few minutes of tense silence, punctuated only by the sound of a dog barking indignantly, you cautiously peer outside. Two men are stumbling away from a saloon, one clutching his arm, the other yelling curses into the morning air. There is no noble standoff, no steely-eyed hero. This was just a drunken argument that escalated with clumsy, inaccurate violence. This is your introduction to Law and Order in the Wild West. Forget the cinematic image of the high noon duel, where two skilled gunslingers face off in a silent, dusty street. Almost never happened. The quick-draw holster was not a common piece of equipment, and the art of fanning a pistol was a trick for showmen, not a practical combat skill. Real gunfights in the West were messy, chaotic, and usually fought at very close range. They were often fueled by whiskey and wounded pride, and they were over in seconds. More often than not, the participants were terrible shots, hitting innocent bystanders, horses, and the side of the general store far more frequently than they hit each other. The air would fill with black powder smoke, making it impossible to see. And the primary skill involved was less about aim and more about not accidentally shooting yourself in the foot. This is a place where violence is a tool, but not in the way the stories tell it. One of the most pervasive myths of the West is that everyone was armed, all the time. The reality is that many frontier towns, in a desperate bid for self-preservation, enacted strict gun control laws. Upon entering towns like Dodge City or Tombstone, you were often required to check your firearms with the local sheriff or at a designated business. The idea of a town where every citizen strolled down the street with a Colt Peacemaker strapped to their hip was a nightmare for local business owners and lawmen. They were trying to build a community, not a perpetual battlefield. Of course, enforcing these laws was another matter entirely. Compliance was voluntary, and there was always someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them. That person was usually the one who started the shooting. And who was there to stop it? the town sheriff. Here we stumble upon another well-worn scholarly debate. The nature of the Western lawman. The myth gives us the lone, incorruptible hero, a man of few words and fast hands, who cleans up a town with moral grit and a legendary firearm. Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok have been elevated to near sainthood in this tradition. The reality, as historians have pieced together, was far less glamorous. Most sheriffs and town marshals were not legendary gunslingers. They were overworked, underpaid civil servants. Their primary duties weren't high-stakes duels, but the soul-crushingly mundane tasks of collecting taxes, serving warrants, breaking up fistfights, and dealing with the town drunk. In fact, a lawman who resorted to his gun too often was often seen as incompetent, unable to keep the peace through presence and reputation alone. They were frequently political appointees, chosen not for their skill with a six-shooter, but for their connections, or their willingness to do a difficult, dangerous job for very little pay. They relied heavily on deputies, if they could afford them, and posses of local citizens when real trouble broke out. This wasn't a story of a single hero against a town of villains. It was the story of a fragile, community-based effort to keep the chaos from boiling over. You might see the sheriff, but he isn't a stoic man in black. He's a tired-looking fellow with a stained vest and a drooping mustache, currently trying to mediate a property dispute between a pig farmer and a saloon owner whose patrons keep trying to ride the pig. This is the reality of justice. It's less high noon and more a very low-stakes, very strange episode of a courtroom drama. The legal system itself is a work in progress. If a crime is committed, justice is swift and often informal. The accused might be brought before a traveling judge, who holds court in the saloon with a jury pulled from the bar stools. Legal arguments are basic, evidence is questionable, and the verdict often depends on the defendant's popularity or lack thereof. If found guilty, punishments are stark and public. There's no complex prison system. You're fined, flogged, or hanged. Justice is meant to be a deterrent, a public performance to remind everyone of the consequences of stepping out of line. You walk past the edge of town and see a hastily built gallows, a stark wooden silhouette against the setting sun. It's a permanent, quiet reminder that life here is cheap. And the law, such as it is, has a very final way of settling arguments. You pull your collar tighter and walk a little faster, deciding that today is a very good day to be quiet, agreeable, and completely uninteresting. You've survived the town, the food, and the distinct possibility of being accidentally shot during a drunken dispute over a stolen chicken. Now you need a job, and the most iconic, most romanticized job in the West is calling your name, the cowboy. You've seen the posters in the dime novels, a lone figure on a noble steed, gazing thoughtfully at the sunset, a master of his domain. The reality, you will soon discover, is less about noble gazing and more about staring at the hindquarters of 1,000 cows for months on end. You sign on for a cattle drive, eager for adventure. Your new boss, a leathery trail boss with a mustache that has its own ecosystem, hands you a horse, a saddle, and a look that says, "I already regret this." The work is not exciting. It is a relentless, mind-numbing grind. Your day begins before sunrise, with the cook's call and a cup of the aforementioned sludge-like coffee. Your job is to move thousands of ornery, skittish, longhorn cattle a few miles north. That's it. That's the whole job. Spend 10 to 14 hours a day in the saddle, riding at a slow, plodding pace. The air is a thick curtain of dust, kicked up by thousands of hooves. It gets in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, and your soul. By the end of the first day, you have a layer of grime on you that feels like a second skin. You don't talk much because there's no one to talk to but your horse, who is already tired of your complaints, and the cows, whose conversation is limited to the occasional mournful moo. The primary sounds are the plodding of hooves, the creak of leather, and the constant maddening lowing of the herd. The glamour of the open range fades quickly. The landscape is a repeating canvas of brown and beige. You are hot, you are thirsty, and you are profoundly bored. But boredom is a luxury, because danger is always lurking, and it rarely comes from a band of masked outlaws. The single greatest fear on a cattle drive is the stampede. All it takes is a sudden clap of thunder, a lurking predator, or even a cowboy sneezing too loudly. and the entire herd can explode into a panicked, unstoppable river of horns and hooves. When this happens, often in the dead of night, it is pure terror. You ride blindly through the darkness, your horse stumbling over rough terrain, trying to turn the herd, to force them to run in a circle until they exhaust themselves. Many cowboys were killed this way, trampled in the darkness, their graves marked by a simple wooden cross in the middle of nowhere. This brings us to one of the most significant scholarly re-examinations of the American West, the myth of the cowboy himself. The classic image immortalized by actors like John Wayne is of a rugged, independent, white American hero, a symbol of masculine freedom and frontier individualism. This image, however, is a carefully constructed fantasy. Modern historians have done extensive work to reveal the true diversity of the men who worked the cattle drives. In reality, the cowboy workforce was a multicultural melting pot. It's estimated that as many as 1 in 3 cowboys was either black or of Mexican descent. The very culture of the American cowboy, the gear, the techniques, the language was heavily borrowed from the Mexican vaqueros, who had been herding cattle in the region for centuries. These were not independent heroes riding for glory. They were low-wage, seasonal laborers working for large cattle companies. They were the agricultural workforce of their day, and life for them was about economic necessity, not romantic adventure. The old view of the lone white hero has been largely replaced by a more accurate understanding of the cowboy as a working-class man of diverse origins. His life was defined by hard labor, not heroic duels. At night, you don't rest easy. You take turns on watch, riding slowly around the sleeping herd, humming or singing softly to keep them calm. The night is vast and filled with the sounds of coyotes. You are exhausted, but you can't afford to fall asleep. A moment of inattention could lead to a stampede or a raid by cattle rustlers. When you finally do get to sleep, it's on the hard ground, with your saddle for a pillow and a single blanket against the biting cold of the plains. You sleep in your clothes, boots and all, ready to leap onto your horse at a moment's notice. You dream of the dust, the sun, the endless swaying backs of the cattle. After a few weeks of this, the idea of a soft bed and a meal that docently consists of beans feels like a distant, impossible dream. This isn't a life of freedom. It's a life of grueling servitude to the herd. The open range you dreamed of is not a symbol of liberty. It's a dusty, lonely, and unforgiving workplace. You still have 1,000 miles to go. After weeks on the trail, covered in a geological survey of dust and grime, you finally arrive at the next town. Get paid a few meager dollars for your trouble, and promptly get sick. It could be anything. Perhaps it was the water, which tasted vaguely of fish and regret. Maybe it was the stew from last night with its ambitious, unidentified meat. Or maybe it's just the sheer exhaustion of it all. Whatever the cause, you have a raging fever. A cough that feels like it's trying to evict your lungs, and a growing sense that you might not make it to breakfast. You need a doctor. This is where your day in the Wild West takes a truly terrifying turn. You find the town doctor's office. It's a small shack with a hand-painted sign that says physician and surgeon, though the paint is peeling. And surgeon looks suspiciously like it was added as an afterthought. You knock, and the door is opened by a man who looks less like a medical professional and more like a retired pirate. He has a magnificent mustache, a stained coat, and the faint aroma of whiskey and failure. This is your doctor. His medical degree might be from a prestigious university, or it might be from a mail-order catalog he found in a Sears Roebuck. You don't ask, you don't want to know. His primary diagnostic tool is to look at you, sigh heavily, and declare that your humors are unbalanced, a holdover from medieval medicine that somehow survived the journey across the Atlantic. His cure for this imbalance is predictable and horrifying. For most ailments, from a common cold to the bubonic plague, the answer is a good purge. This means he will give you something to make you vomit or give you violent diarrhea. The idea being to expel the bad humors from your body. He might offer you a dose of calomel, a mercury-based compound that will indeed purge you while also slowly poisoning you. If that doesn't work, he might move on to bloodletting. It's the same practice that was popular in the 1300s. Is still making the rounds in the 1870s. The doctor will pull out a fleam or a lancetta, sharp tool that hasn't been sterilized since it was forged, and let a bit of your excess blood out into a bowl. The goal is to weaken the fever, though more often than not it just weakens the patient. And what if you have a more serious injury, like a broken bone or a gunshot wound? This is where the surgeon part of his sign comes into play. Surgery is a last resort because everyone knows it's a death sentence. There is no understanding of germ theory. The doctor will operate with unwashed hands, using tools he might have just used to fix his wagon wheel. Anesthesia is rare. Your options are a swig of whiskey, a leather strap to bite down on, or the sweet release of passing out from the pain. The most common surgical procedure is amputation. The wound becomes infected. The only solution is to saw the limb off. The operation itself is brutally fast, a flurry of sawing and screaming. The real danger comes from infection. Gangrene is a constant deadly threat, and without antibiotics, a small wound could easily become fatal. This leads us to yet another point of contention between the Western myth and historical scholarship. The myth presents the heroic frontier doctor, a dedicated man of science who bravely saves lives with grit and ingenuity. While some such individuals certainly existed, the reality was that medical care was abysmal. Many doctors were outright quacks, with no formal training whatsoever. The most common form of medicine available wasn't from a physician, but from a bottle of patent medicine. These snake oils were sold in traveling shows and general stores, claiming to cure everything from consumption and cancer to baldness and moral failings. Their secret ingredients were usually a potent mix of alcohol, opium, cocaine, or morphine. They didn't cure anything, of course, but they certainly made you forget you were sick for a little while, often by creating a brand new addiction. The scholarly consensus is that for most people in the West, the best medical advice was to avoid getting sick in the first place. You, however, are past that point. You politely decline the doctor's offer to bleed you, and instead opt for a bottle of his finest miracle tonic. It costs you a quarter of your pay, but the label promises it will cure fatigue, ague female complaints, and general lowness of spirits. You take a swig. It tastes like cough syrup mixed with regret, but it does make your head feel fuzzy and warm. You stumble back to your hotel room, the world swimming gently around you. You've now been poisoned both by your dinner and by your medicine. You collapse onto your straw mattress, the sounds of the town fading into a hazy, opium-fueled dream. You have survived another aspect of your day in the Wild West. Healthcare.
Ow.
And all it cost you was your health. The miracle tonic, which you now realize is mostly whiskey and laudanum, has dulled your fever to a manageable throb. You decide it's time to leave this particular dusty paradise behind and seek your fortune elsewhere. You purchase a ticket for the stagecoach, the primary mode of long-distance travel for anyone who couldn't afford a private horse. The ticket agent assures you it's a journey of speed and comfort. He is a gifted liar. The stagecoach arrives, and it is not the handsome, polished vehicle of your imagination. It is a rickety wooden box on wheels, covered in dust, and pulled by a team of 6 horses that look as tired as you feel. This is the Overland Express, your chariot to the next chapter of your miserable new life. Comfort is not a word in the stagecoach's vocabulary. You climb inside and find yourself crammed onto a narrow bench with 2 other people. Across from you, 3 more passengers are wedged in, their knees practically touching yours. There is no leg room, no personal space, and the air is already thick with the combined scent of unwashed humanity. The seats are hard leather or rough cloth, and the coach has no suspension to speak of. The only shock absorbers are your own internal organs. The journey begins with a violent lurch that throws everyone against each other. For the next 8 to 10 hours, you will be bounced, jolted, and shaken like dice in a cup. Every rock, rut, and pothole in the trailland. The trail is made exclusively of rocks. Ruts and potholes sends a jarring shockwave through the cabin. Conversation is difficult over the constant creaking of the wood and the rattling of the wheels, which is probably for the best. The company is a random assortment of humanity. Silent prospector who smells of damp earth, a chatty salesman reeking of cheap cigars, and a stern-looking woman clutching a Bible as if it might save her from the next bump. There is an unspoken etiquette to this forced intimacy. You do not discuss politics or religion. You try not to take up more than your allotted 12 inches of seat space. And when the inevitable breakdown occurs, everyone is expected to get out and help. The wheels will get stuck in mud, a horse will throw a shoe, or an axle will crack. You will find yourself shoulder to shoulder with your fellow passengers. Pushing the heavy coach out of a ditch under a blistering sun, the dream of a swift journey dying a slow, muddy death. This brings us to one of the most enduring myths of the West, the constant threat of the stagecoach robbery. We picture masked bandits, led by figures like Black Bart, descending on the coach, guns blazing, demanding the strongbox. And while these holdups did happen, they were not the everyday occurrence that films would have us believe. This is a topic of keen scholarly debate. The old narrative, fueled by Pulp Fiction, positions the outlaw as the primary danger of Western travel. However, historians who have examined the records of stagecoach lines like Wells Fargo have found a different truth. The far greater dangers were mechanical failure and accidents. Coach overturning on a steep mountain pass was a much more common and deadly event than a confrontation with outlaws. Add to this the threats of flash floods, blizzards, and heat stroke. The romantic image of the heroic chase gives way to a more mundane, but no less lethal, reality of simply surviving the journey itself. The fear of being robbed was immense, but the statistical likelihood of dying because a wheel fell off was significantly higher. You travel for hours, the scenery a monotonous blur of sagebrush and distant, hazy mountains. There are no rest stops, no bathrooms. The coach only stops to change horse teams at remote, dusty way stations that make your last hotel look like a palace. At these stations, you have 15 minutes to stretch your legs, use a foul-smelling outhouse, and choke down a meal that tastes suspiciously like the stew you had 2 nights ago. It probably is the same stew. The logistics of feeding travelers across hundreds of miles of wilderness meant that food was basic and repetitive. It's here you learn another hard truth. The West is vast, empty, and deeply indifferent to your suffering. As you bump along, you feel a growing sense of isolation, a small, fragile human being in an immense and unforgiving landscape. The journey wears you down, not with a single dramatic event, but with 1,000 tiny miseries: the dust, the bumps, the cramped muscles, the endless, soul-crushing boredom. You finally drift into a fitful, neck-breaking sleep, your head lolling against the shoulder of the silent prospector. He doesn't seem to mind. You might be asleep, or he might have passed away an hour ago. In the cramped, jolting darkness of the coach, it's honestly hard to tell. The stagecoach groans to a halt in another town that looks suspiciously like the last one, just with a different arrangement of mud and despair. As you stumble out, your bones rattling from the journey, you begin to notice the other half of this world. The one that doesn't swagger in and out of saloons. You see the women? You quickly realize that if you thought the men had it rough, you haven't seen anything yet. For women in the Wild West, life was a different kind of brutal. A relentless gauntlet of back-breaking labor, profound isolation, and the constant, quiet terror of childbirth in a world without medicine. Forget the cinematic archetypes of the helpless schoolmarm waiting to be rescued, or the saloon girl with a heart of gold. The vast majority of women in the West were homesteaders, wives, and mothers, and their lives were defined by work. Endless, grueling, unpaid work. A woman's day began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. It was a cycle of hauling water, cooking meals over an open fire, tending a vegetable garden, sewing, and mending. Every piece of clothing for the family, churning butter, making soap, and raising a flock of children, all while trying to keep a dirt-floored cabin from being entirely consumed by the elements. There were no conveniences. Laundry was an all-day affair, involving boiling water in a heavy kettle, scrubbing clothes on a washboard with harsh lye soap, and hanging them to dry, where they would immediately be coated in a fresh layer of dust. The isolation was a crushing weight. While men might travel for work or gather in saloons, women were often confined to the homestead, miles from the nearest neighbor. Their only company for weeks on end might be their own children. Diaries of frontier women are filled with entries expressing a profound, aching loneliness, a yearning for simple conversation with another woman. The silence of the plains was not peaceful. It was a vast, empty void that could swallow your sanity. This loneliness led to a fascinating and desperate phenomenon: the mail-order bride. With a massive gender imbalance in the West, many men turned to newspaper advertisements to find a wife. Women back east, seeking adventure or escaping poverty, would agree to travel thousands of miles to marry a man they knew only through a handful of letters. It was the 19th century's riskiest form of online dating, a gamble that could lead to a loving partnership or just as easily land a woman in a remote, abusive nightmare with a man who had been very creative with his self-description. This brings us to a significant scholarly debate that has reshaped our understanding of the West: the role and agency of women. The classic myth, perpetuated by films and novels, presents women in two limited roles: the damsel in distress or the fallen woman. Both are passive figures, their lives and fates determined entirely by the men around them. However, modern historians have thoroughly debunked this. They've uncovered a world where women were not just survivors, but active builders of society. They were economic powerhouses. Women ran boarding houses, which were often the most profitable businesses in a new town. They started restaurants, bakeries, and laundry services, essential to the functioning of any community. Many women filed for their own homesteads under the Homestead Act, becoming independent landowners. They were the primary drivers behind establishing schools, churches, and social clubs, the very institutions that transformed chaotic camps into stable communities. The old passive image has been replaced with a more accurate portrait of women as resilient, resourceful, and essential partners in the taming of the West. Yet, for all their strength, there was one danger that loomed over every woman's life: childbirth. In a world without doctors, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of germs, giving birth was a life-or-death gamble. A woman might face labor alone in a sod hut, aided only by a neighbor or a self-taught midwife, whose knowledge was based on folk wisdom and prayer. Complications that are routine today, breech birth, hemorrhaging, infection, were almost always a death sentence for the mother, the child, or both. The infant mortality rate was staggeringly high, and nearly every woman had a story of a child lost to fever, accident, or the sheer fragility of life on the frontier. The quiet, unrecorded grief of these women is one of the most heartbreaking realities of the West. You watch a woman hang her laundry, her face worn but her hands steady, and you wonder what stories of loss and survival are hidden behind her tired eyes. You realize that to last a day here isn't just about surviving the physical hardships, but enduring the profound, silent sorrows that the history books so often forget. You've seen the hard work of the cowboy, the silent suffering of the frontier woman, and the questionable competence of the local doctor. Now, a different path presents itself, one whispered about in the dime novels you've read: the life of an outlaw. It seems like the only truly free life in this harsh land-a-life of thrilling robberies, loyal gangs, and riding off into the sunset with saddlebags full of gold. You quickly learn, however, that the life of a Wild West outlaw was not a grand adventure. It was, for the most part, a short, pathetic, and miserable existence that usually ended in a ditch. Most outlaws were not charismatic masterminds. They're often desperate, poorly educated men who had failed at everything else. They were former cowboys fired for drunkenness, failed prospectors deep in debt, or just drifters with a taste for violence and an allergy to honest work. Their criminal careers were not marked by daring bank heists and train robberies. The most common crime in the West was much less glamorous: stealing horses and rustling cattle. These were crimes of opportunity, often carried out by small, disorganized groups. The daring outlaws of legend were, in reality, petty thieves whose grandest ambition was to make off with a few cows without getting caught. Their hideouts, places like the infamous Hole in Wall in Wyoming, were not the sophisticated fortresses of legend. They were remote, inhospitable landscapes where various gangs could camp and lie low. There was no honor among these thieves. These camps were often just as dangerous as the towns they were hiding from, rife with paranoia, infighting, and the occasional murder over a stolen horse or a share of the loot. Trust was a foreign concept. Your best friend in the gang might sell you out for a pardon or a handful of dollars. You learned to sleep with one eye open, your hand on your gun, not because of the law, but because of the man sleeping next to you. This leads us to a major scholarly debate surrounding the figures of the Wild West. The popular myth, born from sensationalist newspapers and dime novels, often painted famous outlaws, like Jesse James or Billy the Kid, as social bandits. They were portrayed as Robin Hood figures, driven to a life of crime by the injustices of powerful railroad companies and corrupt banks. They were seen as folk heroes who fought for the common man. However, modern historians have largely dismantled this romantic notion. The overwhelming evidence suggests that these men were not principled rebels. They were violent criminals. Their robberies didn't just target faceless institutions. They frequently resulted in the deaths of innocent bystanders, clerks, and lawmen. They preyed on the weak, stole from ordinary people, and were motivated by greed, not a desire for social justice. The idea of the noble outlaw is a comforting story, but the reality was one of brutal, selfish violence. The life was one of constant, grinding hardship. When not hiding out, you were on the run, sleeping in the cold, eating whatever you could hunt or steal, and always looking over your shoulder. There was no glamour, no glory, just a gnawing fear and a deep, bone-wearing exhaustion. You weren't celebrated by the common folk. You were feared and reviled. You were the ones who suffered when you robbed the local stagecoach or stole their livestock. They were the ones who formed the posses, eager to hunt you down and collect the bounty on your head. A life on the run was a life of isolation. Couldn't settle down, couldn't have a family, couldn't trust anyone. Every friendly face could be a potential betrayer. Every quiet town, a potential trap. And there was no retirement plan for an outlaw. Your career ended in one of two ways. You were shot dead by a posse or a rival, or you were caught and hanged. The romantic image of riding off into the sunset was a fantasy. The reality was bleeding out in a dusty street, or kicking at the end of a rope in front of a cheering crowd. There was no honor in this death, no ballads sung about your bravery. You were buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field, your name remembered only as a cautionary tale whispered to children. As you watch a wanted poster being nailed to the wall of the sheriff's office, a crude drawing of a man with a desperate face, you realize the truth. The outlaw life isn't freedom. It's the smallest, most brutal cage of all. You've decided against a life of crime, wisely concluding that a short, violent life ending in a noose is not an ideal career path. But the dream of quick, easy money still glitters on the horizon. You hear whispers, carried on the wind and printed in breathless newspaper articles, of a gold rush. Men are striking it rich in the mountains, pulling nuggets the size of your fist from the cold, clear streams. This, you think, is the answer. This is your chance to escape the cycle of dust and despair. You sell what little you have, buy a mule that looks one bad meal away from collapsing, and join the river of hopefuls heading for the gold fields. When you arrive, the mining camp is a chaotic, sprawling mess of tents, shacks, and mud, clinging to the side of a mountain like a stubborn fungus. It's even more wretched than the cow towns you left behind. The air rings with the sound of pickaxes striking rock and the constant, desperate sloshing of water as thousands of men sift through gravel, their eyes wide with gold fever. This isn't an illness of the body, of the solomanic optimism that convinces a man he is just one panful of dirt away from unimaginable wealth. You buy a pan, a shovel, and a small sack of beans from a merchant who charges you 10 times what they're worth. You notice he has the only well-built cabin in camp and is wearing a fine silk vest. This should be your first clue. The work is brutal, soul-crushing, and cold. You spend 12 hours a day standing knee-deep in an icy mountain stream, scooping gravel into your pan. You swirl it, carefully washing away the lighter dirt and rock, your eyes straining to see a flicker of yellow at the bottom. The water numbs your hands, then your feet. Your back screams in protest from being bent over all day. After a week of this, your hands are raw, your joints ache with rheumatism, and all you have to show for it is a small pile of shiny flecks that amount to less than $1's worth of gold. You see men around you with hollow eyes and ragged clothes, doing the same thing, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and utter despair. This brings us to one of the most persistent and misleading myths of the American West, the story of the lone lucky prospector. The myth tells us that the gold rush was a democratic affair, where any man with a pan and a strong work ethic could strike it rich. It's the ultimate American dream narrative. However, historical scholarship has revealed a much more sobering reality. While a very small number of individuals did get incredibly lucky in the early days of a strike, finding easily accessible gold in streams, this surface-level placer gold was exhausted very quickly. The real wealth, the vast veins of gold, was locked deep within quartz rock, far underground. Extracting it required not a single man with a pan, but massive industrial operations. It required hydraulic mining cannons that blasted away entire hillsides, or deep, dangerous hard rock mines with stamp mills to crush the ore. These operations were incredibly expensive and could only be financed by large corporations and wealthy investors, usually from back east. The individual prospector, the hero of the myth, was quickly marginalized. Most of them found nothing, went broke, either left in disgust or ended up taking a low wage. High-risk job working for the very mining companies that had replaced them. The gold rush, for the vast majority, was not a path to wealth, but a transition from one form of back-breaking labor to another. You abandon panning and try a rocker, a wooden cradle you have to fill with dirt and rock back and forth, washing the debris away. The work is even harder, and the results are the same. You see the corporate mining operations starting up on the hills above, their massive hydraulic hoses tearing away the earth. You realize the game is rigged. The men getting rich aren't the ones in the stream with you. They're the ones in San Francisco and New York who own the equipment and the land. The true gold rush, you understand, wasn't for the miners. It was for the merchants. The men selling shovels, boots, and whiskey at astronomical prices were the only ones guaranteed to leave with a fortune. A common joke in the camps was that the easiest way to find gold was to sell a single egg for $2 to a starving prospector. It was a bitter truth. The camp is a dangerous place. Disputes over claims are common and often settled with fists or knives. There is no law here, but the law of the strongest. Men, driven mad by exhaustion and disappointment, drink their meager earnings away in ramshackle saloons. The nights are filled with drunken shouts and the occasional gunshot. You lie on your thin bedroll, listening to the sounds of desperate men, and you feel the gold fever you arrived with, slowly chilling into a cold, hard understanding. There is no easy money here. There is only work, pain, and the vanishingly small hope that keeps these men sifting through the mud day after day. You look at the few pathetic flakes of gold in your pouch. It's not a fortune, it's a fool's wage. With your dreams of gold dust turning to, well, just dust, you leave the mountains behind. You drift for a while, taking odd jobs, feeling the immense, crushing emptiness of the landscape. It's during this time, on the edges of the ever-expanding frontier, that you encounter the original inhabitants of this land, the Native American tribes, and you witness the slow, grinding, and deeply tragic reality of their existence in the face of American expansion. The dime novels and campfire stories had painted them in two stark, simple colors. Either the noble savage, a child of nature speaking in wise, clipped sentences, or the bloodthirsty warrior, a faceless threat to be overcome. The reality you see is neither of these things. It is something far more complex and heartbreaking. You see peoples being systematically displaced, their way of life actively dismantled. You see tribes who have lived on these lands for centuries, with complex social structures, religions, and traditions, being pushed onto reservations. These are often barren, unwanted tracts of land, a fraction of their ancestral territories, where the hunting is poor and the soil refuses to grow crops. The U.S. government makes treaties, grand promises written on paper, guaranteeing these lands to the tribes for as long as the grass grows. You quickly learn that in the West, the grass has a very short memory. As soon as gold is discovered, or a new route for the railroad is planned, these permanent treaties are broken, and the tribes are forced to move again. The destruction of the buffalo is one of the most visceral and devastating sights. For the Plains tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche, the buffalo was everything. It was their source of food, shelter, clothing, and tools. It was the center of their spiritual universe. You see the railroad bringing in hunters from the east, men who shoot the animals by the thousand from the windows of moving trains, not for food but for sport and to sell the hides. They leave the carcasses to rot on the prairie, a landscape of death that stretches for miles. This isn't just hunting, it's a deliberate strategy of extermination endorsed by the government. The saying, "Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone," is whispered with a chilling satisfaction. By destroying the buffalo, the government knew it could destroy the independence of the Plains tribes, forcing them onto reservations and into a life of dependency. This dependency is managed by a system that is, at its core, deeply corrupt. This is where you learn about the Indian agents. These are the government-appointed officials in charge of the reservations. Their job is to distribute the food, blankets, and supplies, annuities that were promised in the treaties. The reality is that many of these agents are corrupt, stealing the best supplies and selling them for their own profit. They give the tribes rotten meat, moth-eaten blankets, and insufficient grain, leaving them to face the brutal winters with empty bellies. This institutional cruelty is a constant source of tension, often boiling over into violence. Here we encounter another great debate in Western history, the portrayal of the Native American. The old, classic narrative of the West, popular for over a century, casts them as the savage antagonists, a monolithic force standing in the way of progress and manifest destiny. This view justified the violence and dispossession as a necessary part of building a nation. However, modern historical scholarship has completely overturned this. Historians now emphasize the incredible diversity of native cultures, languages, and political systems. They were not one people, but hundreds of distinct nations. The narrative has shifted to focus on their perspective, highlighting their sophisticated adaptation to their environments, their diplomatic efforts to preserve their lands, and their fierce resistance against overwhelming odds. The story is no longer simply about the taming of the West, but about the catastrophic cultural destruction that this taming entailed, and the incredible resilience of the people who endured it. You see this resilience firsthand. You see the quiet dignity of the people, their efforts to maintain their traditions in the face of overwhelming pressure. You hear their languages, their songs, their stories. You see their frustration and anger, the pain of broken promises. You begin to understand that the violence you hear about, the so-called Indian Wars, are not acts of random savagery. They are often acts of desperation, the last resort of a people with their backs against the wall, fighting for their very survival. You realize that in the grand story of the Wild West, you are not the hero. You are, by your very presence, part of the problem, a pawn in a game of expansion and conquest that is leaving a trail of sorrow in its wake. This realization is a heavier burden than the dust, the hunger, or the loneliness. It is the weight of history itself, and it's a weight you will carry long after you leave the frontier behind. Haunted by the quiet sorrow you've witnessed on the plains, you drift back toward the noise and clamor of a town, seeking something to numb the feeling of distraction, a bit of entertainment, anything to make you forget for a few hours. In the Wild West, entertainment means one thing above all else: the saloon. It is the town's social heart, its theater, its gambling den, and its unofficial therapy office, all rolled into one smoky, whiskey-soaked package. You push through the swinging doors, a piece of cinematic iconography, and step inside.
Ow!
The reality is, as always, less impressive than the myth. The saloon is not a grand, glittering hall. It's a long, narrow room, dimly lit by kerosene lamps that cast a greasy yellow glow. The air is so thick with tobacco smoke, you could carve it with a knife. The floor is covered in a thick layer of sawdust, stained dark with spilled beer, tobacco spit, and other liquids you try not to identify. The legendary bar is not a polished mahogany masterpiece. It's a long, rough plank of wood laid across two barrels, its surface sticky and scarred with knife marks. Behind it, a mirror, clouded and fly-specked, reflects the grim, tired faces of the patrons. This is the place you've come to for a good time. The entertainment is rudimentary at best. In the corner, a man is attempting to play a piano that has been abused by the climate, the customers, and the passage of time. Several keys are missing, and every note he plays sounds like a cry for help. No one is listening anyway.
Ow.
The main event is gambling. Men huddle around small, rickety tables playing faro, poker, and monte. The games are quiet, intense, and fueled by cheap whiskey. The stakes aren't just money, they're pride. A misplaced card or an accusation of cheating can, and often does, escalate from angry words to overturned tables to the dull, terrifying flash of a drawn pistol. The house, you notice, always seems to win. This is another area where the Hollywood myth diverges sharply from historical reality. Saloons in movies are often depicted as lively, almost cheerful places, full of beautiful dancers, heroic gamblers, and witty banter. The truth, historians argue, is that most were grim, male-dominated spaces, or functional, not decorative, designed for the serious business of drinking and separating men from their wages. The famous saloon brawls where a hero smashes a chair over a villain's back were not theatrical displays. They were swift, brutal, and often ended with someone bleeding out in the sawdust. While some larger towns had more elaborate variety theaters, with singers and dancers, The average frontier saloon offered little more than a warm place to get drunk and lose your money. As for the drinks, the choices are limited. The whiskey is cheap, often unaged, and potent enough to strip varnish. It's sometimes called tarantula juice or coffin varnish, names that are both a joke and a warning. The real delicacy, if you can call it that, might be a free lunch. Some saloons offered a spread of food to entice drinkers, but the quality was questionable. You might find pickled eggs floating in a cloudy jar, a plate of stale crackers and cheese, or a pot of that same eternal mystery stew you encountered before. It was less a culinary offering and more a way to soak up enough alcohol so you could order another round. You do see some women here, but they are not the glamorous showgirls of legend. They are the saloon girls, or hurdy-gurdy girls, their faces weary beneath a layer of cheap makeup. Their job is to serve drinks, laugh at bad jokes, and sometimes, for a price, offer a dance in the back room. It is a hard, precarious life, one that exists on the very edge of respectable society. These women are not romantic figures. They're survivors, navigating a dangerous world with a forced smile and a watchful eye. You sip your warm beer, the tinny piano clanking in the background, and watch the slow, grim theater of the saloon unfold. This, you realize, is the peak of entertainment in the Wild West. It is not about joy or artistry. It is about a brief, expensive, and dangerous escape from a life that is otherwise defined by hardship. The laughter you hear is a little too loud, the arguments a little too sharp. Everyone here is trying to forget something, and the saloon is more than happy to sell them the oblivion they crave, one watered-down whiskey at a time. You leave the saloon, your head throbbing from the bad whiskey, and your spirit aching from the forced, joyless entertainment. You decide that the company of men is overrated, and that a little time alone on the prairie might be just what you need. You couldn't be more wrong. You have now come face to face with the single most powerful, most ruthless, and most unpredictable killer in the entire Wild West. The weather. There are no cozy forecasts here, no Doppler radar, no friendly meteorologist telling you to pack an umbrella. There is only the vast, indifferent sky, and it is actively trying to murder you. If you are on the northern plains in the Dakotas or Wyoming, you learn the terror of the blizzard. It does not arrive politely. A beautiful, clear day can turn into a white-walled nightmare in less than an hour. The temperature plummets, and the wind begins to howl with a sound that seems to come from the throat of a dying animal. Then the snow begins, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal sheet that erases the horizon, the ground, and your own hands in front of your face. Getting caught in a blizzard on the open prairie is a death sentence. There are no landmarks, no shelter. You can wander in a circle for hours, just feet from your own cabin, and freeze to death, your body not found until the spring thaw. Even inside your sod hut or log cabin, survival is a battle. Snow blows through every crack in the walls, piling up in drifts on the floor. The fire sputters, fighting against the drafts. And you spend the night huddled under every blanket you own, listening to the wind trying to tear your house apart. Then there is the heat. In the deserts of Arizona or the plains of Texas, the summer sun is not a warm friend. It is a malevolent god. The heat is a physical weight, pressing down on you, leaching the moisture from your body. The air shimmers, the ground cracks, and the world seems to bleach into a single, pale, dusty color. Water is life, and there is never enough of it. Wells run dry, rivers shrink to a muddy trickle, and you learn to measure your day not in hours, but in sips from your canteen. Heat stroke can kill you swiftly, and dehydration will do it slowly, leaving your body brittle and your mind wandering through feverish mirages. This is where historical scholarship has shed light on the great tragedy of the homesteading movement. The classic American myth celebrates the stoic homesteader who tamed the wild prairie through grit and self-reliance. Failure was often seen as a personal moral failing. The truth, as environmental historians have shown, is that survival was often a matter of climatological luck. The government and railroads lured settlers west during unusually wet periods, advertising the plains as a new Garden of Eden where rain would follow the plow. Thousands of families staked their hopes and life savings on this promise. But when the inevitable cyclical droughts returned, their farms withered. The earth turned to dust and blew away in great black clouds that choked the sky for days. These families were not lazy or incompetent. They were the victims of a climate they didn't understand and a government that had sold them a lie. They packed their wagons and left, their dreams buried under a layer of dust. Perhaps the most terrifying weather phenomenon is the prairie fire. In the dry season, the vast grasslands are a tinderbox. A single spark from a passing train or a careless campfire can ignite an inferno that moves faster than a galloping horse. You see it on the horizon, a rolling wall of orange and black, and you know you have only minutes to react. You try to dig a fire break, a desperate trench in the hard-packed earth, or you huddle in a creek bed, praying the flames will pass over you. The roar is deafening, the heat is blistering, and the smoke is a thick, choking blanket. If you survive, you emerge into a blackened alien landscape. Your cabin, your crops, and your livestock all turn to ash. The West doesn't just challenge you, it erases you. You learn that here, the greatest dangers are not the bandits or the beasts, but the sun, the wind, and the rain. You are a tiny, fragile thing, and nature is a giant that can crush you without even noticing you are there. After surviving the elements, the questionable medicine, the back-breaking labor, and the constant low-grade fear that defines life on the frontier, you begin to see a new force arriving. It doesn't come on horseback, and it doesn't carry a six-shooter. It comes on rails of steel, singing a song of steam and smoke. It is the railroad, and it is the beginning of the end. The Wild West, that brief, violent, and chaotic period of American history, was ultimately not tamed by sheriffs or outlaws, but by technology and barbed wire. You stand on a small hill and watch the railroad crews working their way across the prairie. It's a monumental, brutal effort. Men, mostly Chinese and Irish immigrants, labor under the same harsh sun you've come to know, laying track mile after grueling mile. They are bringing the modern world with them, whether the West wants it or not. With the train comes a flood of new settlers, far more than ever arrived by wagon. It brings manufactured goods, law books, and Eastern newspapers. The isolated, self-reliant towns you've passed through are now connected to the rest of the country. Suddenly, there is a faster way to ship cattle than a 3-month drive, and a faster way to call for help than the Pony Express. The telegraph lines that follow the tracks hum with messages, shrinking the vast, lonely distances. The world is getting smaller, and for the kind of freedom the West once represented, smaller is not better. Then comes the second, quieter killer of the open range. Barbed wire. Patented in 1874, this simple invention was a revolution. Before it, the plains were a vast open sea of grass, belonging to everyone and no one. Cattle could roam freely. But now, homesteaders can fence their land cheaply and effectively. A few strands of this devil's rope can close off hundreds of acres, protecting crops from wandering cattle. The result is the end of the open range. The great cattle drives that defined the cowboy era become impossible, as traditional trails are blocked by endless fences. This leads to violent fence-cutting wars between the cattle barons, who need the open land, and the farmers, who need to protect their livelihoods. But it's a war the ranchers cannot win. The era of the cowboy, that brief chapter of American history, is choked to death by a few strands of pointy wire. This brings us to a final great historical debate. When did the Wild West actually end? For a long time, the answer was 1890. That was the year the U.S. Census Bureau officially declared that the American frontier, that line between settled and unsettled land, was closed. There was no longer a vast, unbroken wilderness to conquer. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner famously argued that this closing of the frontier was a turning point for the American identity, which had been forged in the crucible of westward expansion. This view presents a neat, tidy ending to the story. However, modern historians argue that the end of the West was a much messier, more gradual process. There was no single moment. Instead, the wild elements faded away bit by bit. As towns grew, they established police forces, fire departments, and schools. The arrival of the railroad made the transport of goods and people reliable and safe. The rule of law, once arbitrary and violent, slowly became more institutionalized. The West didn't end with a final heroic gunfight. Ended with the arrival of property taxes, paved streets, and town councils that argued about sanitation. You watch as the town you're in begins to change. A proper brick courthouse is built. The saloons, once the center of all social life, now have to compete with a new church and a temperance league. The women of the town, once isolated, form literary societies and quilting bees. The chaos is being replaced by something else: order, predictability, civilization. For many, this is a welcome relief.
For you.
Who has survived the untamed version, it feels like a kind of death. The wildness, for all its brutality and hardship, had a certain raw freedom to it. That freedom is vanishing. The old-timers, the grizzled prospectors and retired cowboys sit on porches, their eyes on the horizon, looking for a world that isn't there anymore. They are becoming relics in their own lifetime. You realize you wouldn't survive a day in the Old West, but you also understand, with a strange sense of melancholy, that the Old West itself did not last much longer. It was a fleeting, feverish dream, and the world was waking up. As you sit on the porch of the now slightly less grand Palace Hotel, watching a brick building go up where a muddy ditch used to be, you feel a strange sense of dislocation. The world you barely survived is vanishing before your eyes, being paved over and painted, tidied up and tucked away. And in its place, something new is being born. The myth. You start to see it in the pages of the cheap dime novels for sale at the general store. In their lurid illustrated covers, the tired, desperate men you knew are transformed into steely-eyed heroes. The clumsy, drunken gunfights become ballets of righteous violence. The grueling cattle drives become epic adventures across a majestic, empty landscape. The story of the West is being rewritten as it happens, and the real version, the one you lived, is being quietly erased. The dirt, the disease, the crushing boredom, the casual brutality, the flies, none of it makes for a good story. So it's left out. The writers, most of whom have never been west of the Mississippi, prefer tales of noble outlaws, stoic lawmen, and daring cowboys. They are creating a fantasy, a national campfire story that is far more comforting than the truth. You pick up a novel and read about a heroic cowboy saving a rancher's daughter from bandits, you snort. The cowboys you knew were more likely to be saving themselves from a bad case of food poisoning after eating their own cooking. This process of myth-making accelerates with astonishing speed. The most fascinating, and perhaps most surreal part of this, is when the real figures of the West begin performing as fictionalized versions of themselves. You hear about a man named William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill, who has started a Wild West show. It's a traveling extravaganza, a kind of historical theme park, complete with staged gunfights, Native American dancers, and trick-shooting performances. He even hires real-life legends like Sitting Bull and Annie Oakley to tour with him. They become living artifacts, reenacting a sanitized, theatrical version of their own history for cheering crowds back east. The brutal reality of the Indian Wars is transformed into a thrilling spectacle of cowboys and Indians. The hard, lonely life of the plains is reduced to a parade of colorful characters. This is a central point of scholarly debate. What was the purpose of this myth? The traditional view saw it as a harmless and even valuable celebration of American ideals individualism, manifest destiny, and the taming of a wild frontier. It was the story America wanted to tell itself about its own origins. However, modern historians see a more complex and troubling purpose. They argue that the myth of the Wild West was a powerful tool used to justify the often brutal reality of expansion. By creating a simple, heroic narrative of civilization versus savagery, the myth conveniently glossed over the darker truths. The forced removal and genocide of Native American peoples, the exploitation of immigrant laborers, the environmental devastation, and the raw corporate greed that fueled much of the expansion. The story of the lone hero conquering the wilderness was a much cleaner, more palatable narrative than the story of a government systematically destroying one way of life to make way for another. You watch the children in the town playing. They're no longer pretending to be farmers or blacksmiths. They are playing cowboys and outlaws, their imaginations fired by the stories they've read. They run through the now tamed streets, mimicking the quick draws and heroic last stands that never really happened. You, a survivor of the real thing, feel like a ghost at your own funeral. The world you knew, for all its misery, was real. This new world, the world of the story, feels like a pale and dangerous imitation. It's a world that has traded the hard, complicated truth for a simple, glorious lie. And as you sit there, listening to the distant whistle of a train, you realize that the Wild West was not truly conquered by guns or railroads. It was conquered by its own legend. The story became more real, more powerful, and more enduring than the place itself. And you, a relic of a forgotten reality, can only watch as the sun sets on the West that was, and rises on the West that never was. And so, as the last of the kerosene lamps in the newly built courthouse flicker out, and the once wild street settles into a quiet, orderly grid, our journey through the real West comes to a close. The dust has settled, not just on the trail, but on an entire era. The world you walked through, a place of raw survival, of quiet desperation, of mud and manure and misery, has faded, replaced by the cleaner, simpler lines of its own legend. The true sounds of the West, the creak of a wagon wheel, the hacking cough of a sick miner, the lonely cry of a coyote under a vast, unforgiving sky. All have been softened, turned down, and replaced by the heroic soundtrack of a story we needed to believe. The cowboy you thought you knew has ridden off, not into the sunset, but into the pages of a book, leaving the tired, underpaid laborer behind. The gunfight you imagined has been polished into a duel of honor. Its clumsy, terrifying reality wiped clean like a dusty bar top. The immense, soul-crushing hardship has been transformed into a noble struggle, a grand adventure. And now, the memory itself is what remains. A ghost town of what was, shimmering in the heat haze of history. Let the dust motes settle in the quiet air. Let the sounds of the saloon fade into a distant, tinny echo, then into silence. Let the vast, empty prairie stretch out into the soft darkness of your sleep, peaceful at last. The day is over. Struggle is done. You are safe now, far from that world, carried on the gentle current of your own breathing, back to the comfort of your own quiet room. Rest now. The West has been won and lost.